Hey guys, welcome back to another video of React Native development. So in the previous video we went through a little bit of screen navigation and we were starting to build up our structure on how we're going to store our data, right? So we were going to go put in a state and we're going to use dispatch to send commands and then store data into the state. So we started creating the provider. One thing that I forgot to do in our directory setup was create a new folder, directory, call it actions, and inside of here we'll create a JavaScript file and call it types. So this is where we're going to store our commands that we're going to send. We had discussed if we're going to log in, we're going to send a login message, and every other statement after that will do an action after it registers that this is a login statement. So if we have a look at that, all we need to do is just type export const and then what we're going to call it. So let's do the first one as restore user equals restore user, just like that. And we can go ahead and duplicate this 5 times, and then we've got our login. Do that, log out, set to do, and set errors. Set errors like that. Right, so restore user is going to in our splash screen, that's our loading screen, it's going to check to see if the user is already logged in, and it's going to do that by checking in our async storage. If it is, it's going to send this command, and any code that is registered to listen for this command will be triggered. Same with login, logout, set to do, and set errors. The login allows us to, of course, go to our authenticated screens. Logout disconnects us from our authenticated screens and sends us back to our unauthenticated screens. Set to do will set our to do tasks that we create in the home screen, and set errors will set any errors for error validation and error handling. So now that we've got our types out of the way, we can go ahead and go back to our provider class and start creating that. So inside our provider class, we're going to utilize two methods called create context and use reducer. So before we do that, let's go ahead and bring our imports in. So import React as we did before, and then let's go ahead and bring all of our types from our type file we just created in actions. So that's login, logout, set to do, and set errors, just like that. And then we'll bring in our is empty just for validation. And first things first is let's create an object called initial state. So as the app starts, this is what our state is going to be like. So the structure will be is loading. We'll put that to true because by default it will load. Is authentic or auth for short, but it means is authenticated. Put that to false. So by default, they're not going to be authenticated. They're not logged in. And then user will be an empty object. That is our user object. So after they've logged in, our user information will be stored in there. To do items, this is going to be an array, an empty array to begin with, and this is where we're going to load in our to do items for the user. So this way we store it in our state, and only the user's items will be in there, not every single item. And then an errors object. So this is where we'll put all of our errors, if any occurs, and if an error does occur, the app will read it from there, and depending on the errors that's relevant, place it to the fields that's relevant to. So now let's go ahead and create a store variable. So we're going to use react.createContext here, and we'll provide our initial state into that. Now this store is where we're having our information, our storage, our local storage. so our entire app can access that. So let's go ahead and create our provider class now. So const provider equals arrow function, just like that. And as a parameter, we're going to take children from it. So children is, as we saw, if we, let's say when we create our views like that, wants it to be imported, fine, import it. Oops, actually no, it needs to be in here like that. Okay, so when we were creating our view like that, let's go ahead and get rid of the import. We're putting items inside of here. So as you can see, this space here, we might put stuff like buttons or text. So everything inside of the view is a child, and we can access that by putting children in the props. Give me 1 second, guys. Sorry about that. Right, so yeah, these components here are children of that view component. We can access that through that parameter here, this prop here. So let's go ahead and create our return, which will be store. So I've put store like that, dot provider. Right, so we're going to take the provider outside of this store here, and put that as our kind of container. And next we're going to bring in the object, so curly brackets, and put children here, because we're going to use this provider object like so. Right, we're going to use a provider object like that and put any children in here like that, because our provider object needs to be the main class, so then every other children can access the information from it. Now in our export, so before we do an export default, we're going to go ahead and export store and also export default provider. So by default, when you import this class, you'll get the provider, but you can also additionally take store out of it. Just like in React, we can do something like this, where we can actually just take create context out and use reducer, just like that. And we don't need to do react.create context. We can just do that. So if you know exactly what methods you're going to use, you can just go ahead and import it like so. We just leave it like that, that's fine. Now, this class is a little bare bones at the moment. What we need is the brains, which is going to be our reducer. So let's go ahead and do const state and dispatch equals use use reducer. So it's similar to how we call use state in the past, but this time we're using use reducer, and inside of here we're going to provide a an arrow function method, and we're going to be able to pull two parameters from it, and the old state and an action. So the old state will be whatever this information was. So the initial state is this. So the first time we update it, this will be the old state, and our action will be the commands or the kind of stuff we sent with it. So inside of there, there's a type. That type will be kind of like the command. So these types here, and you can also send payload with it, data, etc. So we'll go through that now. So what we can do is switch. Switch is similar to an if statement, but you can have multiple cases within it. So you don't need to go if else, if else, if else, if else, because this basically does that. And then we can do case, restore user, and then return empty object. So and inside of the switch, we need to put action.type. So what this is saying is switch. So if, or not necessarily if, but get whatever's inside of action.type. Now that can be restore user, and then here case is saying if action.type is equal to restore user, then return this content here. So what we'll do is return our old state. So I'll tell you why we're doing that in a second. And then we'll provide is auth. So here we'll do is empty action.user. So now we're accessing action again, and inside of there we've got user. So that is a form of data, right? And then our user will be action.user, and is loading is now false. So the reason I put old state here is because we're only changing 3 parameters here. Reason we're only changing 3 is because we don't need to access to do items or errors in that. We're only modifying this stuff. And then we can create another case, and we can call this case login. Right? It's essentially a case for each of these basically. And then we'll go ahead and put an empty array like that for now. Let's go ahead and duplicate this. So you can control D, we need to do about 5 of them. So we've got login, logout, set to do, and set errors. So now for our login case, we're going to go ahead and return the old state again. So we're going to add that to all of them. Should have probably done that first, so we can just go ahead and do that. And then we're going to return is auth is now true, and our user is action.user. There we go. So now for our logout one, we're going to put is auth is false, and user is an empty object. And then set to do, go ahead and put to do items action.to do items, like so. And set errors will be errors action.errors. And one last thing we need to do is provide our initial state, just like that, so that way it will get used. And we've got state and dispatch. Cool. So now we've got a lot of stuff here. One more thing we do is put value inside of store.provider, and the value here will be state and dispatch. So when we call to receive the data from this provider, what we're going to actually receive is the state and the dispatch, and we can then check what value is inside of the state currently, and we can use dispatch to change any of it. So once we call dispatch, it's going to trigger this switch statement, and depending on what we put inside of the dispatch method parameter, it'll trigger any of these. You can add a default if wanted, so you can do default and then by default return anything. We don't need it here, but you may have a use case where you need it. So that is our provider state, and then, or provider class, sorry. And in the next video, we'll actually use it, and I'll show you how it actually works. So thanks guys, see you then.